relation of metaphysical dependence. And I'm just going to kind of talk through the handout that is available in the chat. If this ends up not working, just ask me. That I can also share my screen. That's fine too. So just keep me posted. So as I start out by saying here, throughout philosophical history in every tradition, metaphysicians have attended to what is fundamental and to how what is fundamental, non-fundamental metaphysically depends on what is fundamental or on what is more fundamental. But there's some controversy, quite a lot of interesting controversy about which relations are suited to explain and characterize the metaphysical dependence of non-fundamental on more fundamental goings-on. So I want to consider today whether identity is reasonably taken to be, in at least some cases, a relation of metaphysical dependence, specifically of the sort that would support there being a difference in priority. So my own view is that some metaphysical dependence relations might not be associated with priority, directions of priority or differences in priority. That's because I think, as I will mention down the line, that, for example, fundamental goings-on might be self-dependent or mutually dependent, and so on. So I think that metaphysical dependence is a necessary condition for a difference in priority, but it's not itself sufficient. Okay, just to clarify. So I'm interested in whether identity can be a relation of metaphysical dependence, specifically of the sort that would bestow a difference in priority among the relata, so to speak. So, you know, I want to say in it, just to kind of motivate the topic, that on the face of it, the answer is yes, or at least many views presuppose that the answer is yes. So for example, reductive physicalism, according to which all special scientific or goings-on are identical to some or other ultimately fundamental, the more fundamental, lower level physical goings-on. And in the footnote of this handout, I talk about a bunch of other cases. I mean, there's many, many more. The list could go on indefinitely. You know, philosophical reductions, scientific reductions, heat is mean molecular kinetic energy as a kind of toy study, or philosophical analyses, etc., where, for example, every dispositional property is identical to its categorical base property, etc. But today I want to focus specifically.
Sorry, that one is unmuted.
You can mute all, and I can then unmute myself. Yeah. Okay. Sounds okay. So today I want to focus specifically on, you know, an application of reductive physicalism to the case of mental states. So here it is. Mental states are identical to and less fundamental than lower level physical states. So it should be. And here I'm, you know, kind of being neutral about whether we're talking about a type identity thesis or a token identity thesis. So I'll talk about mental states kind of neutrally. Maybe that will matter down the line in Q&A, we'll see. Now, this thesis and related conceptions of identity as a dependence relation face at least two objections, but in my view, I think they face these two main objections. First is that if you're going to have a relation of metaphysical dependence, then that relation must be irreflexive and asymmetric. But since identity is reflexive and symmetric, it can't be such a metaphysical dependence relation. And then the second concern is that by Leibniz's law, goings-on which are identical, at least at a time, etc., must share all their properties. So if a mental state M is identical to a physical state P, then M cannot be less fundamental than P. without violating the indiscernibility of identicals. So I want to consider certain strategies for responding to these objections. I have mentioned some of these strategies in other of my papers, in particular in my 2014 paper, No Work for a Theory of Grounding. But you know, there's been some back and forth. For example, Karen Bennett has responded to certain of the things that I said. I just want to fill in these, you know, my thoughts on this issue, and you know, both fill in general what the objections are, different responses, and address some of the concerns with my responses and fill those in and so on. But what I really hope with respect to, you know, the workshop format is to get feedback on, you know, of course, whether what I'm saying is correct, but also maybe helpful suggestions about, you know, the project, as it were. I'm kind of just kind of working on this in the course. I'm drafting a book on fundamentality and metaphysical dependence, and I want to have a dedicated chapter to this issue. So this is kind of a first pass on that chapter, and the content of that chapter. Okay, so we'll start with the objection from irreflexivity and asymmetry. So here's, you know, one way of formulating the objection that you find in Gideon Rosen's classic 2010 paper. He says, with respect to irreflexivity, the case for irreflexivity is clear enough. Just as no fact can make itself obtain, no fact can play a role along with other facts in making itself obtain. And with respect to asymmetry, he says, when we cite grounds for P, some fact that P, we cite facts that are strictly prior to P in a certain explanatory order. If Q plays a role in making it the case that P, then Q must be more fundamental than P, in which case P cannot play a role in making it the case that Q. So these are, you know, sort of motivations for thinking that a metaphysical dependence relation must be irreflexive and asymmetric. By way of sort of filling in what the concern might be here, I just want to start by noting that there are reasons to resist thinking that, quote, no fact can make itself obtain, unquote, and also to resist thinking that when we cite grounds for P, fact P, we do so with the aim of registering difference in priority, or at least we always do so, right, with such an aim. For, as I was prefiguring earlier, on many accounts of fundamental structure, metaphysical dependence relations will hold between goings-on at the same level of priority. And so just to mention a few examples, you might have a self-constituting God on, you know, various conceptions of Buddhism, for example, Huayan Buddhism. All goings-on are equally fundamental and interdependent. You might have a view according to which, given that quirks, individual quirks can only come in twos and threes, you know, Thomas Taco and I have both talked about how, you know, there might be a case to be made that those quirks are sort of interdependent in a way, and yet equally fundamental and arguably fundamental on some views. So given such possibilities of, you know, these seeming cases of fundamental structure where you have entities which are self or mutually dependent and yet fundamental or at the same level of priority, it might be better to suppose that metaphysical dependence is non-reflexive, with some cases being reflexive, some being irreflexive, and non-symmetric, with some cases being asymmetric and some cases being symmetric. Just leave it open, look at the cases. But then one might suggest, if that's correct, the mere fact that identity is reflexive, and I should say symmetric here, needn't count against it being a dependence relation, okay? And Carrie Jenkins has made a similar observation in her excellent paper, is metaphysical dependence reflexive? Yeah, irreflexive. It's metaphysical dependence irreflexive, where she knows that there's a bunch of there's many views out there, for example, that statues depend metaphysically on their composing matter and are in fact identical with their composing matter. So if supposing we want to keep those views on the table, she says considerations of methodological neutrality speak against assuming irreflexivity of dependence. So I think that's right, but I don't think that's the end of the story with respect to, Rosen's considerations, because, he could respond by saying, okay, that's fine. In cases where metaphysical dependence is not necessarily being offered as tracking a difference in priority, maybe there can be reflexive or symmetric dependence. But what about in these other cases where it is supposed to be tracking priority? Then said dependence relation had better be irreflexive and asymmetric, for then how else could a difference in priority get off the ground? And another consideration, a related consideration that you see in, for example, Fine's paper, The Question of Realism, as well as other discussions of metaphysical grounding understood one way or another. Since these dependence relations, claims to the effect that there is a dependence relation, these enter into explanations of some goings on in terms of some others. And since explanatory relations must be irreflexive in order to be informative, right? You can't explain one thing in terms of itself. Then the dependence relations themselves must be irreflexive and also asymmetric given transitivity, because we could end up with a reflexive relation if we have asymmetry plus transitivity. Okay, so now this is the sort of case that we have when we're talking about mental physical state identity. So the reductive physicalist is maintaining that the mental state types are posterior to, hence explained in terms of the physical state types to which they are identical, rather than vice versa. But then the question remains, how can this metaphysical and epistemological asymmetry be accommodated if the dependence relation at issue is reflexive and symmetric? Okay. So I want to start first by considering a deflationary strategy for kind of responding to the initial concerns that Jenkins and I have raised, whereby there are these live views which appear to involve both a dependence claim and a priority claim, but where the relation at issue is identity. So she says in her recent book, Making Things Up, highly recommended. She says the following, in response to these suggestions that dependence relations can be reflexive or symmetric. Jenkins and also Ricky Bliss seem to suggest that reductive physicalism, our very case, involves reflexive building, for they say that mental states, types, or tokens are both identical to and built from physical states. But this rests on a misunderstanding of the view. The relevant kind of physicalism might be carelessly stated using both identity talk and building talk, but no physicalist actually thinks that identity and building hold between the same relata. Rather, the identity theorists claim is that pain, for example, is identical to a high-level built physical state, some complex neurological state perhaps, that is in turn built from lower level physical states. So the pain is identical to some physical state A, and A is built from physical states B, C, and D, these lower level physical states. So the physical facts that build the mental facts aren't the same facts as the ones that are identical to the mental facts. The claim that reductive physicalism constitutes a case of reflexive building just gets the relata wrong. So, her claim is that really it's the fundamental physical facts B, C, and D upon which the mental state depends, this plural kind of ground, so to speak. Now, I think Bennett is certainly right that the physical states to which the mental states are supposed to be identical are themselves non-fundamental. Okay, talk of them being higher level is a little bit of shorthand in a context where we're talking about reductive physicalism. So, you know, a reductive physicalist really thinks there's only one level. There's just the, you know, level of physical goings on, which includes these complex aggregates or pluralities of lower level physical goings on. But that's not important. She's right that the physical state to which the mental state is supposed to be identical is itself non-fundamental relative to more fundamental physical states, which also are occupying that level. So, you know, you could have the physical state to which the mental state is supposed to be identical. It will, like on an physicalist atomism, you know, a bunch of atoms standing in atomic relations, some very highly complex configuration, you know, and a property thereof would be the sort of physical dependent space for the mental state. However, I don't think that it's so easy to resolve the difficulty just by observing that there is, in fact, a more fundamental physical base, so to speak, for the physical state at issue. First of all, I don't think that her claim that the physicalists really don't mean what the reductive physicalists don't really mean what they say, I find that implausible. If they intended to claim that mental states are metaphysically dependent on multiple lower level physical states, as she seems to be suggesting here, they would have said so. And in fact, it seems like that many one understanding of dependence is just a different view entirely. It's something like, you know, for example, Carl Gillette's compositional mechanism, or these kind of constitutive mechanism views where there's many one dependence. Some, you know, Carl will talk about it as being a realization relation. Some people reserve realization relations for these one-to-one relations, but in any case, it's not reductive physicalism so far as I can tell. You know, identity-based reductive physicalism. That's one point. Second point, identity and realization-based forms of physicalism are close cousins, which agree that the physical bases for the mental states are themselves non-fundamental. So they're, you know, complex physical states that themselves are based one way or another, completely metaphysically dependent one way or another on more fundamental physical goings on. But non-reductive physicalists are clearly not appealing to realization as shorthand for the mental states being built, as Karen would put it, by what builds their realizer. So they're that's definitely not what they're saying. Realization definitely is a one-to-one relation, and it's not shorthand for whatever it is that serves as the, you know, more fundamental physical basis for the realizing state. So that's the case, but then why I think that reductive physicalists are doing that? You know, they're both one-one kind of accounts of what's going on. They both think that the physical states are themselves non-fundamental. So why I think that in the case of realization, they get to stick with their view, but the reductive physicalists must really be talking about something else. I don't think that's right. In any case, this strategy really only pushes the bump in the rug. And in this respect, focusing on reductive physicalism about mental states is a little bit, you know, it's like a special case where identity is offered as a metaphysical dependence relation, but there's many other views that are on offer on which identity is a metaphysical dependence relation, but there's no prospect of reconceiving that talk of identity as being shorthand for some other irreflexive dependence relation. So for example, Pryor, Pargetter, and Jackson maintain that the dispositions of a thing are always grounded in its categorical features. And relatedly, Armstrong maintains that every dispositional property is identical to its categorical base property, but those categorical bases might themselves be simple. They might be not dependent on anything else. And so you couldn't make that move. So we could switch and start talking about the question about whether those kinds of views can be, we can make sense of those kind of views where this kind of deflationary strategy that Bennett is offering would not be applicable. So I think we should just say, well, on the face of it, the reductive physicalists mean what they say, and notwithstanding that these physical states are themselves non-fundamental, reductive physicalists are still going to maintain that they are more fundamental than the mental states. So the dialectic that we started with, I think, is still in play. And so the question remains, can we make systematic good sense of this and other identity-based accounts of dependence? So here's a couple of strategies for trying to make sense of this. So the first one is that the asymmetry of dependence can be located not in the specific grounding relation itself, but in relevant extrinsic considerations involving the relata. So, for example, perhaps a reductive physicalist can locate this asymmetry in the broadly extrinsic fact that every mental state type is identical with the physical state type, but not vice versa. Okay, so that's an extrinsic asymmetry that, you know, as per this suggestion, that can serve as a basis for there being a difference in priority in cases of identity. Or perhaps a reductive physicalist can locate this asymmetry in the fact that the fundamental goings-on are all physical, whereas the fundamental goings-on are not all mental. Okay, so the idea is to fish out for some kind of external or extrinsic asymmetry as kind of the basis for the difference in priority at issue. And I just want to point out that this suggestion, in particular, the latter instance of the suggestion where you talk about like the fact that the fundamental, on this view anyway, the fundamental goings-on are all physical, whereas the fundamental goings-on are not all mental. And in fact, none of them may be mental. Barbara and I are, you know, characterizing physicalism in this way, as ruling out that there is fundamental mentality. This suggestion is actually, well, I'll put it positively, it's more systematic than it may initially appear. And that's because I think in general, these metaphysical dependence relations do not themselves do this work of fixing priority. In my estimation, they serve as priority fixers or dependence relations in this sense against a backdrop specification of what is fundamental, primitive specification of what is fundamental. So to start just by motivating the idea that the relations don't themselves come with a fixed direction of priority, you can look, for example, at these various debates, for example, between monists who thinks that the cosmos qua whole is fundamental, or the pluralist who thinks that the, for example, atomic parts are fundamental. They both can agree that the relationship between the cosmos and its proper parts is parthood, right? But obviously they are associating different directions of priority with that very same relation. Their debate is not over what relation is at issue. They agree that it's parthood, mereological parthood. They just think in the case of the monists that the direction of priority points from the whole to its proper parts. And in the case of the pluralists, that the direction of priority points from the proper parts to the whole. Moreover, a proponent of either of these views doesn't have to say that, for example, the monist doesn't have to say that every whole is more fundamental than its proper parts. They can allow that there's differences, you know, the different instances of the parthood relation can point in other directions. So, for example, Schaffer, who thinks that the cosmos is the one fundamentum and all its proper parts are non-fundamental, can allow that the legs of a table are more fundamental than the table. You know, that's just an option. He's explicit about that. So the question then is, how are the instances of these relations which serve as metaphysical dependence relations, what I have called small g grounding relations, just to flag that we're not talking about a distinctive primitive metaphysical dependence relation, what more is needed for them to do this work of fixing priority? And what I suggest is that a plausible answer is that it's a primitive specification of the fundamental is what is really doing the work here. So, there's a larger story to be told here, but very briefly, there's a kind of two-part strategy. First, there's this primitive specification of which goings on are fundamental. Once that's done, then the small g relations, can kick in and establish that some entities are non-fundamental vis-a-vis the fundamenta, right, in some specific way. So for example, given that the cosmos is primitively specified as fundamental, as the only fundamentum, then the parthood relation between the cosmos and its proper parts will point from whole to part. So the primitive specification of the fundamental in this, it kind of sets a valence to the parthood relation when holding between the fundamentum and other entities which are not fundamental. On the other hand, given that the atoms are the sole fundamenta, then the parthood relation between atoms and the cosmos will point from the parts to the whole. Okay. Now that's like stage one, where we're talking about, we get the fundamental and we can set up certain small g relations between the fundamental and the non-fundamental. What about priority relations between the non-fundamental? I think ultimately they too indirectly advert to the primitive specification of what is fundamental, because now that we have our stories about the natures of the non-fundamental as small g generated from the fundamental, then, and we know how the non-fundamenta are, related to each other, we can start going to work doing some metaphysics and trying to determine, like, if there are priority relations between these non-fundamenta. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't, and if there are, which direction they go in. So I think that this idea that the primitive specification of the fundamental is acting as a kind of extrinsic determiner of priority relations is actually part of a larger story that can be told about an attractive account of the structure of natural reality, the metaphysical structure of natural reality, which involves this primitive specification of what is fundamental, and then the small g relations that we already know and love, kind of doing the work of imposing structure, further structure on reality. Okay. Okay. What about the second strategy for trying to make sense? The asymmetry of dependence can be located not in the specific grounding relation itself, dependence relation itself, again, but now not in extrinsic considerations, but rather in intrinsic considerations involving the relata. So perhaps a reductive physicalist can locate this asymmetry in the broadly intrinsic fact that the physical state type to which the mental state type is identical is an ontologically lightweight. For example, lower level relational, atoms standing in atomic relations, or Boolean, disjunctive, or mereological combination of other physical state types rather than other mental state types. So there you look into the physical state type, into its intrinsic constitution, and determine that it is constituted by physical state types, not mental state types. And so that offers another way of establishing an asymmetry, which is not based in the dependence relation itself. So once we start thinking about how, one state might be, one physical state might be metaphysically dependent on some others, these attributions of priority in these cases are plausibly tacitly adverting to the one relatum, the one state, as mental or physical. So the idea is that it can fall, this one state, which is, associated with the identity claim, is falling under more than one category, so physical or mental, with the relatum qua physical being more fundamental than the relatum qua mental. And this will be relevant in strategy of response to the second objection. But I think actually it's kind of common to both of the strategies here in this first, with respect to the first concern about irreflexivity and asymmetry, you know, where we're kind of pinning the asymmetry on the fact that the physical state is part of a, you know, fundamental physical base, or it's itself constituted by physical goings on and so on. So the qua physical is getting in here to do some work. Okay. So now, what about the second objection, the objection from Leibniz's law? This originally was a concern that was raised to me by Karen Bennett. And she said, well, look, identity can't be a priority associated metaphysical dependence relation, because if there were a difference in priority between the relata, then that would seem to violate Leibniz's law. So how can, in particular, how can goings on which differ in priority be identical since they have different properties? You know, one is less fundamental than the other, then by Leibniz's law, they must in fact be different. So my initial response in that 2014 paper was kind of brief, and here's what I said. According to the ontological reductionist, a state token or type may be shared by different systems. In such cases, the qualification of the state as fundamental or not reflects the status of the state as part of a system of states that is or is not appropriately taken to be fundamental, either on intrinsic or extrinsic grounds, as a working, speculative, or antagonistic hypothesis. Qua physical, part of a physical system of states, a belief is fundamental. Here I should really say, you know, more fundamental, right? For the reasons that should be clear given the previous discussion. According to the reductive physicalists, qua mental, part of a mental system of states, that same belief is not fundamental. Less fundamental, I should be saying, more and less there. This sort of strategy, which is a variation on strategies discussed by David Lewis and by Alan Gibbard, seems to me to make sense of how identical entities can have different properties. So I was going to implement this strategy also discussed by Jenkins, who suggests that taking metaphysical dependence to be hyper-intentional can make room for identity theories. So that's her suggestion in the paper I mentioned earlier. And she locates a hyper-intentionality in this notion of dependence itself. To say that depends on is hyper-intentional is to say that it creates context into which one cannot always substitute necessarily coextensive terms salva veritate. This option is importantly compatible with ontologies that identify brain states with pain states, namely ARCHÉ or variation on ARCHÉ. We are free to identify S as pain with the brain state that grounds it should we wish, for reasons of parsimony, say to do so. So we can keep reductive physicalism on the table without running afoul of Leibniz's law. So, you know, the idea would be that if I say that the pain is more fundamental than the brain state, but then I say the pain is identical to the brain state, and then I substitute salva veritate, I'm going to get that the brain state is more fundamental than the brain state, but that's impossible. So, you know, one way of kind of pitching this Leibniz's law concern is that it runs you into contradiction. Okay. So now Bennett challenges me in her book. She considers my strategy, but she argues that it doesn't work, at least on one way of kind of filling it in. So it needs to be filled in. So I want to say a little bit more by way of filling it in. So she starts by nicely setting out my suggestion. So my trick is to appeal to referential opacity. To say that the expression more fundamental than creates an opaque context so that the flanking expressions cannot be replaced with co-referring terms salva veritate. That is, on her view, the following three claims are compatible. A is more fundamental than B, A is identical to B, and it is not the case that A is more fundamental than A. Okay, kind of going through what I just sketched. So Bennett observes that, quote, the claim that the predicate more fundamental than creates an opaque context needs to be supplemented with a story about why it does so. A story, if you will, about the metaphysical underpinnings of this semantic phenomenon. So she says the following, basically, sorry, I repeated that here, and then she asks, what is my story? Why would more fundamental than, unlike other comparative adjectives, create an opaque context? She does not say. And she's right, I don't say. Now, Bennett then considers whether one sort of strategy for providing a metaphysical underpinning for the opacity at issue doesn't work. And this would be one where it was more along the lines of that implemented in Quine's discussion of Giorgione was so-called because of his size. So Giorgione is identical with Barbarelli, but Barbarelli was not so-called because of his size. So what that looks like, a violation of Leibniz's law, also gets you into trouble if you can substitute salva veritate. You run into, a falsehood anyway. And what Quine suggests is that you can make sense of this if so-called is ambiguous and in different contexts, kind of syntactic context, it picks out different properties. And it's got kind of like some kind of argument placed or otherwise needs to be filled in with a name because it, to be so-called, has to refer back to the specific name that's at issue. And so the truth conditions of a sentence in which that so-called appears have to rely on that. So you can't just substitute salva veritate in that case. And she argues that, if I were to try to make out that there's somehow an ambiguity in more fundamental than, so that there's different notions of more fundamental than, that won't really help. But that's not what I had in mind. So I just want to say briefly what I do have in mind. And this is the part where I really do need to kind of go get more into the literature pertaining to opacity and do more philosophy language than I'm usually used to doing and so on. But the key idea is that my explanation for the opacity at issue relies not in an ambiguity in more fundamental than, but rather on the supposition that in cases of identity-based dependence, attributions of relative fundamentality attached to the relata qua members of different levels, or more precisely systems of laws, right? Like the mental system of laws or the physical system of laws along lines, again, reflecting that for the reductive physicalists, for example, there's really only one level. Okay, so say a little bit more about this. So for example, given that A is identical to B, the claim that A is more fundamental than B is properly elucidated on this approach. It's really the claim that A qua physical is more fundamental than B qua mental. Now, if we do that, then even if you could substitute referring expression salva veritate into such qua context, a clearly false claim that A qua physical is more fundamental than A qua physical would not follow. Moreover, if such contexts are opaque, as I'm suggesting they are, the reductive physicalists can avoid commitment to substitution, salva veritate, and ergo to the somewhat odd, though not clearly false, claims such as that B qua physical is more fundamental than A qua mental. Okay. So this approach, as I am seeing it, still inchoately, somewhat inchoately at this point, this approach to the locating of the opacity at issue is more along lines of that proposed in Gibbard's treatment of the Lumpel-Goliath case. So in that case, he wanted to say, yeah, there could be contingent identities he allowed. right? So given certain contingencies where both Lumpel and Goliath come into existence at exactly the same time in a world, and they both go out of existence exactly at the same time in the world, you know, considerations of parsimony and physicalism and stuff might push you towards saying that they were identical. But, you know, they have different persistence conditions. So, you know, qua statue and so on, you can survive removal of part of your arm or whatever, but qua lump you can't, and so on. So the difference in persistence conditions indicates that at other worlds are not identical. So how do you make sense of this? And he suggested that meaningful cross-world identities of such things as statues, it seems, must be identities qua something, qua statue or qua lump, where, you know, this qua talk is adverting to persistence conditions in a certain way, compatible with there being referential overlap at a world. So you can make out the identity claim while still preserving the differences in persistence conditions and, you know, opacity considerations block certain kinds of contradictions. So I think what I'm suggesting is more along lines of that, as opposed to there being some kind of ambiguity in the expression more fundamental than. It's rather that when we are making these kind of, we're using identity to, or associating an identity claim with a difference in priority, we are tacitly thinking of the entities at issue as, you know, qua physical or qua mental. And given that we have independent reason to think that the physical is more fundamental or is fundamental, then we have a basis for distinguishing the states in this kind of broader way, qua physical or qua mental. And, you know, ergo, this is supposed to explain opacity and make it at least comprehensible that identity can be a metaphysical dependence relation, notwithstanding the indiscernibility of identicals. So I don't have a conclusion here, but, you know, I think I've hoped to argue, you know, by providing these various strategies to show that there's at least considerable room to maneuver to include identity as metaphysical dependence among our, you know, our usual, the many relations in our metaphysical toolkit that can serve to illuminate dependence in all its interesting varieties. That's it. Thank you.